My son died 8 months ago, or at least that's what his wife told me. Every 2 weeks, I drove from my place in Thunder Bay down to Sudbury, 4 hours each way to hand her $800 in cash. I did it without complaint, without question, because that's what a father does. Then one afternoon, the woman at my insurance broker's office pulled me aside and said, "Mr. Callahan, I think you need to look more carefully at your son's life insurance claim. Something here doesn't match up." That's when everything I'd believed for 8 months fell apart around me. I'm glad you're here. Before this story goes any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below and tell me your city or province. It helps more than you know. And before we begin, I want to be transparent with you. Some elements of this story have been shaped for narrative clarity. Any resemblance to specific real individuals is coincidental. But the lesson woven into every line of this story that is completely real. Now, let me tell you what happened. My name is Gerald Callahan. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a millwright at a paper mill outside Thunder Bay, Ontario. My hands tell that story better than my words ever could. Thick knuckles. A scar across the left palm from a conveyor belt incident in 2003. The kind of permanent stiffness that comes from decades of cold mornings and heavy machinery. I retired at 62 with a modest pension, a small detached house on a quiet street, and what I thought was a reasonably good understanding of the people I loved. My son, Thomas, was 34. He'd moved to Sudbury 7 years ago for work, underground mining, decent pay, union job. He married a woman named Sylvie 2 years after that. I liked Sylvie well enough at first. She was organized, sharp, and knew how to run a household. They had a daughter, my granddaughter Lily, who turned 7 last spring. Lily had her father's dark hair, and my mother's habit of tilting her head to one side when she was thinking hard about something. Thomas and I had a complicated relationship. I won't pretend otherwise. He was stubborn in the way that only a son raised by a stubborn man can be. We argued about money, about choices, about the years he felt I'd worked too much and been home too little. By the time he was in his late 20s, those arguments had softened into something quieter and more manageable. We weren't best friends, but we were father and son in the truest sense. We showed up for each other. He called every Sunday, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Then the calls stopped. Sylvie phoned me on a Tuesday morning in late February. She said Thomas had been in an accident at the mine. A piece of equipment, a malfunction. The details blurred together because of what she said next. She said he hadn't made it. I drove to Sudbury that same day, 4 hours through gray February sky and highways slicked with ice. Sylvie met me at the door of their house. Lily was at her grandmother's, Sylvie said. She thought it was better that way. I sat at their kitchen table and let Sylvie explain the details of private burial. Per Thomas's wishes, she said, no funeral service. He hadn't wanted a fuss. He'd told her that once, apparently, some years back. I stayed 2 days. I met with nobody. I saw no body. I was handed a death certificate and a folded piece of paper with the funeral home's stamp on it confirming cremation. I drove home with a cardboard box of Thomas's things, a watch, some photographs, a flannel jacket I'd given him the Christmas before last. I put the jacket on the hook by my back door and left it there. 3 weeks later, Sylvie called again. The insurance from the mining company had come through, but there were gaps. Medical bills from the hospital, the night of the accident, equipment liability, lawyers who needed retaining, and a mortgage that had just been restructured. She wasn't asking me, she said. She just wanted me to know how things stood. I told her I'd help. $800 every 2 weeks, handed over in cash when I made the drive down to Sudbury. I told myself it was for Lily, that the money kept a roof over my granddaughter's head, that Thomas would have done the same for me. I was grieving. I was alone. My wife, Patricia, had passed 4 years earlier from a stroke, and writing that check, making that drive, was the only thing that still connected me to my son. By late October, I'd made 17 payments. $13,600. And I hadn't been allowed inside the house once. Sylvie always met me at the door, sometimes on the porch before I'd even knocked. She'd take the envelope, check the contents briefly, thank me in that careful, measured way she had, and explain that Lily was sleeping, or eating, or at a neighbor's. I'd stand on that doorstep for 2, maybe 3 minutes, and then I'd make the drive back to Thunder Bay. I told myself grief looks different for everyone. I told myself Sylvie was protecting Lily. I told myself a lot of things on those 4-hour drives north. The visit that changed everything was a Thursday in early November. I'd come a day early because I had a plumbing job Friday morning I couldn't cancel. I hadn't called ahead. I parked on the street instead of the driveway. My truck was making a noise I didn't want to aggravate on the gravel. I walked to the front door, knocked twice, and stood back. It took longer than usual. I could hear movement inside. Television, then something else, voices, low, more than one person talking. Sylvie opened the door about halfway. She was wearing a blouse I'd never seen, her hair down, and there was a brightness in her expression that flickered out the moment she recognized me. Gerald. Her voice was flat. You're a day early. I know, I said. I have a job tomorrow morning. Here's the envelope. She took it without checking it. Her eyes moved past me toward the street, then back. Is Lily home? I asked. She's in bed. Sylvie began to ease the door back. She's been fighting a cold. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. No 7-year-old was in bed at 4:30 for a cold. I just want to say hello, I said. I haven't seen her in 6 weeks. Sylvie's jaw tightened. She's asleep, Gerald. I don't want to wake her. We'll figure out a visit soon. Maybe around Christmas. From somewhere deeper in the house, behind a closed door down the hallway, I heard a sound. Not the television. A man's voice, low and even, the kind of voice that belongs to someone comfortable in a space, relaxed. At home, Sylvie's expression didn't change, but her hand pressed slightly harder against the door frame. I nodded. I said goodnight. I walked back to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment with the engine off, watching the lit windows of that house, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in 8 months. Not grief, something colder, something that asked questions I'd been afraid to ask. I drove north. The highway back to Thunder Bay was dark and mostly empty, the way it gets in November once the tourist season is gone. The boreal forest pressed in on both sides, black against black. I turned the radio off and drove in silence, and let the questions come. Why had there been no visitation, no service, no gathering of any kind? Why had I never been permitted to see Thomas's body? Why had Sylvie insisted on cash, every time? Always cash. Who was the man in that house? I almost talked myself out of it by the time I reached the city limits. Thomas's death was registered. I had the certificate in a file folder at home. The mining company had confirmed the accident through their HR department, though that confirmation had come by email from a generic company address, and only after Sylvie had told me it would arrive. I'd been so deep in grief that I'd accepted every piece of paper set in front of me without looking closely at any of them. I made myself a cup of tea and stood at my kitchen window and stared at Thomas's flannel jacket on the back hook. Then I called my brother-in-law, Reg. Reg Fontaine had been married to Patricia's older sister for 38 years. He was 69 now, semi-retired, and he had spent 22 years as a fraud examiner for a major insurance company in Ottawa before moving back to northwestern Ontario. He was meticulous, patient, and allergic to nonsense. Patricia had always said that Reg could find a discrepancy in a glass of water. I told him everything. The death, the payments, the cash, the locked door, the man's voice. Reg didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for 10 full seconds. Come to Dryden Saturday, he said finally. Bring every document you have. On Saturday morning, I spread everything across Reggie's dining room table. The death certificate, the cremation confirmation, the email from the mining company, printouts of every e-transfer I'd made before Sylvie asked me to switch to cash. Reg put on his reading glasses and went through each document with the kind of focus I imagine surgeons use. After 40 minutes, he set down the death certificate and looked at me over the tops of his glasses. This certificate number, he said, pointing to a string of digits near the top of the page. Do you know how Ontario Vital Records numbers are formatted? I didn't. Reg turned the laptop toward me. Ontario death certificates issued after 2018 follow a specific regional coding prefix before the registration year and sequential number. He showed me an example from a public records database. Then he showed me Thomas's certificate again. The prefix is wrong, Gerald. Not close to wrong. Completely wrong format. This wasn't issued by the province of Ontario. The room felt smaller. There's more, Reg said. He pulled up a second window. I ran the attending physician's name, Dr. Francis Ouellette. There's no physician registered with the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario by that name. No one in Northern Ontario. No one anywhere in the province. I reached out and gripped the edge of the table. And this, Reg said, pulling up the mining company's website. He navigated to the HR contacts page. The email that confirmed the accident to you, it came from this address. He pointed to the email I'd printed. Now look at the actual company domain. Off by one letter. One letter, Gerald. It's a spoofed address. Anyone could have created it. I stared at the screen. Reg leaned back in his chair. He took his glasses off and cleaned them, slowly, the way he always did when he was about to say something he'd rather not. Gerald, I've been doing fraud work for over 2 decades. I want to be careful here because I could be missing something, but what I see in front of me looks like a fabricated death. Everything that would require official verification, the certificate, the physician, the employer confirmation is fake or unverifiable. And your payments have been going to a woman who won't let you in the house. I thought about the funeral that never happened. Patricia's funeral had filled a church. Friends, former colleagues, the neighbors from 3 streets over. The idea that Thomas, who'd coached Lily's soccer team, who knew half of Sudbury's mining community by first name, the idea that not one person had gathered to mark his passing had bothered me from the beginning. I'd swallowed that feeling out of respect for what Sylvie said were his wishes. She told me he didn't want to fuss, I said. Reg nodded. Convenient, isn't it? That afternoon, Reg called a contact of his, a woman named Detective Corporal Anne Tremblay, with the OPP's Financial Crimes Unit in Sudbury. He'd worked with her years ago on an insurance fraud case. She was, he said, careful, thorough, and not someone who made accusations before she had facts. We drove to Sudbury on Monday morning. I sat across from Detective Tremblay in a small office with a whiteboard and a window that looked out onto a parking structure. She reviewed everything Reg had compiled. She asked me clear, specific questions. She wrote, without looking up from her notepad for most of it. When I finished, she set her pen down and folded her hands on the table. Mr. Callahan, she said, before I say anything else, how is your relationship with your granddaughter? I told her about the locked door, the 6 weeks since I'd last seen Lily, the Christmas promises that had never materialized. She nodded. Then she said, I'm going to start making some calls. I need you to not contact Sylvie or anyone connected to her while we work on this. Can you do that? I told her I could. The drive back to Thunder Bay took 4 hours. I spent most of it thinking about Patricia. She had adored Thomas in the way that mothers adore difficult sons fiercely, without conditions, with a running undercurrent of patient frustration. When he'd moved to Sudbury, she'd worried about the mining work. Too dangerous, she used to say, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. She'd made him promise to call her every week. He had, right up until she passed. Patricia died in June, 4 years ago. Aneurysm, sudden, overnight. I found her in the morning. She'd gone peacefully, the doctor said, which I've always found a strange way to describe something so violent in its absence of warning. And 8 months ago, when Sylvie had called to tell me Thomas was gone, the first thing I'd felt before the grief, before the disbelief, was a terrible gratitude that Patricia hadn't lived to hear it, that she'd been spared that particular loss. Except now I sat in a truck on the Trans-Canada with the dark Ontario forest closing in from both sides, and I turned that thought over in my mind and felt sick. If Thomas was alive, if he was alive, then Patricia had died never knowing her son had chosen to disappear. She'd spent her last years carrying the weight of a rift that Thomas had apparently decided was more comfortable than confronting, and I had no way to know if the distance between them in those final years had contributed to the exhaustion I'd seen in her. The quieter version of my wife who sat in the garden less and rested more and told me once, very softly, that she hoped Thomas knew she loved him, even when she didn't know how to say it. I gripped the steering wheel and drove. Reg called me the following Thursday. Anne found him, he said, without preamble. I pulled over on a side street and sat with the engine idling. Thomas is alive, Gerald. He's been living in a rental property in Hanmer, just outside Sudbury. The property is rented under a numbered company, but the numbered company traces back to a man named Darren Poulin. Darren Poulin is Sylvie's first cousin. He's also listed as a co-signer on a lease for a storage unit in Chelmsford. I couldn't speak. There's more, Reg said. Sylvie filed a life insurance claim through the mining company's group policy 8 months ago. The policy was for $400,000. The claim was submitted with the same death certificate you were given. The insurance company flagged it 2 months ago because of the physician discrepancy. That's actually how Anne's unit got involved initially, before we ever contacted them. They hadn't connected it to you yet, but now they have. $400,000. And the $13,000 I'd given them on top of that. The storage unit in Chelmsford, Reg continued, is registered as being rented since last January, 1 month before the supposed accident. They were planning this before Thomas died, or before Thomas pretended to die. I stared through the windshield at a street of ordinary houses. Someone's front porch light was on in the middle of the afternoon, orange against the gray November sky. "Where's Lily?" I asked. "At the house in Sudbury with Sylvie, as far as we know," Reg said. "Anne's team is moving carefully because of Lily. They don't want her frightened." "And Thomas, has anyone spoken to him?" "Not yet. They're still building the file. But Gerald, there's something else. Something I want to tell you before you hear it another way." He paused. "Anne found a booking. 2 round-trip tickets, Sudbury to Vancouver, departing November 28th. Passengers, Sylvie Marcotte and Darren Poulin. One way, continuing from Vancouver to Cancun." I counted in my head. November 28th was 11 days away. "And Lily?" I said. Reg was quiet for a moment. "There's no booking for Lily. No booking for my granddaughter. They were going to leave her." I said it out loud without meaning to, my voice flat and strange in the cab of the truck. "That's what it looks like," Reg said quietly. "I'm sorry, Gerald." 11 days. I asked Reg what we needed to do. He said, "Trust Anne. Stay off the phone with Sylvie, and be ready to move when she calls." I drove home and sat in my kitchen and looked at Thomas's jacket on the hook. I thought about the Sunday calls that had stopped. I thought about how I'd assumed it was the distance and the long shifts and the ordinary friction of adult life, because that was the most bearable explanation. I thought about how I'd handed over $800 in a white envelope every 2 weeks and stood on a porch in the cold and asked, quietly, if I could please say hello to my granddaughter, and been told no. I thought about Patricia holding a cup of tea and saying too dangerous. I picked up the phone and called no one. I had made a promise to a detective, and I kept it. On the morning of November 26th, 2 days before the Vancouver flight, Detective Tremblay called at 7 a.m. "We're moving today," she said. "Can you be in Sudbury by 11? I was on the highway by 7:15. I sat in an unmarked OPP vehicle parked half a block from Sylvie's house. Reg was beside me. Detective Tremblay and another officer were in the front. 2 more vehicles were positioned around the corner. We'd been there 40 minutes when a gray pickup truck I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. The driver's side door opened. I knew the way he moved before I could see his face. The particular set of his shoulders, the slight forward lean he'd had since he was a teenager, the way he paused with his hand on the door of the truck, as if checking a mental list. "That's my son," I said, and my voice came out very quiet, the way sound goes when the ground shifts under you. Thomas walked to the front door. He had a key. He went inside without knocking. Tremblay picked up her radio. "All units hold. We wait until Poulin arrives." Darren Poulin showed up 19 minutes later in a white SUV with Quebec plates. He was 41, thick-necked, wearing a winter jacket and carrying a duffel bag. He went inside. Tremblay said, "All units move." The vehicles converged. Officers were at the front and side doors before I'd fully processed that it was happening. Reg put his hand on my arm and we followed at a distance. The front door was open when I reached the porch. I could hear voices inside. Then Sylvie's voice rising. Then silence. I walked through the door of that house for the first time since Thomas's fake funeral. The living room had suitcases against the back wall. Brand new, expensive, 4 of them. The kind you buy when you're not planning to come back. In the hallway, Thomas stood between 2 officers. He was looking at the floor. His jaw was tight. When he heard my step on the hardwood, he looked up. We looked at each other across a hallway in a house I'd been locked out of for 8 months, and neither of us spoke for a long moment. "You're alive," I said finally. I wasn't sure if it was an accusation or just a fact I needed to say out loud. "Dad." His voice broke on the word. "Dad, don't," I said. "Not here. Not like this." Tremblay stepped between us. She was reading Thomas his rights. Sylvie was already being walked out the front door by another officer. She didn't look at me. She kept her face turned toward the street. Darren Poulin was in the kitchen, asking for a lawyer in a voice with all the panic of someone who thought he'd been careful and has just discovered he wasn't careful enough. Then I heard a small sound from the staircase. Lily was on the fourth step from the bottom, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, wearing a red sweater, and the expression of a child who understands that something is very wrong and is waiting to find out how wrong. "Hey, Bug," I said. "Come here." She came down the last 4 steps at a run and pressed her face into my chest. I put my arms around her and held on. She was trembling slightly, the fine shiver of controlled fear, and she smelled like the lavender soap Patricia used to buy. "Grandpa," she said against my jacket, "why are the police here?" "Everything is going to be all right," I told her. "I've got you. I'm not going anywhere." She tightened her arms around me. I held my granddaughter in a house full of officers and suitcases, and the rubble of 8 months of lies, and I told her it was going to be all right, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant anything in a very long time. Reg appeared at my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He put one hand briefly on the back of my neck, the way he used to do when Patricia died, and then he stepped back and gave me room. 4 months later, I sat in a courtroom in Sudbury, with Lily beside me and Reg on my other side, and I watched a judge deliver the findings. Sylvie received 7 years for fraud over $5,000, conspiracy, and uttering forged documents. She showed no expression when the sentence was read. Darren Poulin received 6 years for conspiracy, fraud, and document forgery. He was also ordered to pay full restitution. Thomas received 4 years for his role in the fraud, reduced from a higher charge because he had cooperated extensively with the investigation and because the insurance payout had been frozen before any funds were accessed. The $400,000 was never collected. The $13,600 I had paid was recoverable from seized assets. I was granted full custody of Lily. The insurance company's civil recovery team handled the rest. In the corridor afterward, a court officer let Thomas speak to me for a few minutes before they took him back. He looked smaller than I remembered, thinner. He stood in front of me with his hands at his sides and said, "Dad, I need you to know I didn't think it would go this far. I thought it was just the insurance. I thought Sylvie had a plan. I was already so deep in it by the time I understood what we were actually doing. I listened to my son explain himself in the fluorescent light of a courthouse corridor. I thought about the flannel jacket on the hook by my back door. I thought about Patricia saying too dangerous, about Lily on the 4th stair in her red sweater. I thought about $13,600 driven south in white envelopes because I'd believed what I was told. "Thomas," I said, when he'd finished, "I believe that you got in deeper than you planned. I believe that part, but you chose the first step, and the second, and every step after that, and your mother died without knowing you were alive. She spent the last 4 years of her life feeling a distance between the two of you, and you knew, and you said nothing. He couldn't hold my gaze for that. I'm going to forgive you," I said, "not because what you did was small. It wasn't small. But because I'm 64 years old and I'm raising your daughter and I don't have the energy to carry this as well. When you've served your time, and when you've shown Lily, not me, Lily, that you're someone she can trust, then we can talk about what comes next. That's not my decision alone anymore. It's hers." He nodded. He pressed his lips together hard. The officer touched his elbow and they walked away down the corridor. I stood there for a moment and then I went back to find Lily and Reg. The restitution payment came through 6 weeks later. I sat at my kitchen table in Thunder Bay with the paperwork in front of me and a mug of coffee going cold at my elbow, and I wrote out a list. Lily's room renovation. New bed, bookshelves, a desk, the yellow paint she'd chosen herself from the hardware store on Arthur Street. $1,500. Education, trust in Lily's name. $10,000. Locked until she was 18. University, trades, her choice. New tools for the workshop in my garage. I'd been meaning to properly set it up for 5 years. Patricia had always said I needed something to do with my hands in retirement. She was right, as she usually was. $4,000, the remainder into savings, because, as Reg likes to say, the furnace never breaks in July. I looked at the list and thought about my wife. She would have had opinions about every item on it. She would have suggested the desk be bigger, the savings amount higher. She would have worried the yellow paint was too bright, and then decided she loved it after seeing it on the wall. She would have sat across this table and told me that things work out the way they're supposed to, and she would have meant it in a way that made me believe it too. I put the list in the kitchen drawer and went to get Lily from school. On a Saturday in late March, we drove out past the city limits to a spot on the shore of Lake Superior, where Patricia and I used to walk on Sunday afternoons. The ice was still thick near the shore, but had begun to pull back in the middle, the deep, cold blue of open water starting to show through. Lily walked beside me, wearing the red sweater, her boots crunching on the snow. She